Montana Territory. June 1883. The wind carried the scent of wild sage and old sorrow when Francesca Merritt buried her husband. The preacher's words faded under the weight of the sun. Dust clung to the hem of her black skirt, and her hands trembled against the wooden cross hammered into the dry earth. Her two children, Wilfred and Willa, stood silent on either side of her, too young to understand just how alone they were now. Wilfred clung to her sleeve. Willa stared at the grave like it might give her father back if she just wished hard enough. Francesca didn't cry. Not yet. Not until the last of the mourners rode off in their buckboards, tipping their hats with murmured sympathy. Not until the wind picked up and scattered the last handful of dirt over the mound. Then the tears came, hot and quiet. She dropped to her knees in the brittle grass, arms wrapped around her children, and wondered how she was supposed to keep them safe, feed them, protect them, now that Thomas was gone. The ranch was too big, too broken, and too dry to run alone. She had no brothers, no father left, and no money to hire help, just 36 acres of stubborn land and a pair of frightened children, and grief that hung on her shoulders like a wet coat. "Ma," Wilfred's voice cracked. "Willa's cold." Francesca turned, brushing Willa's hair from her cheek. She nodded and stood, gathering them both close. She was halfway back to the house when she saw the rider waiting at the gate. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, with a rifle slung across his back and the kind of stillness that made the horses calm. Dust coated his boots clear to the knees. His hat was tipped low, but not low enough to hide the scar that ran along the side of his jaw, white against tanned skin. She didn't recognize him. "Afternoon," he called, voice low, steady. "Name's Prescott Hale. I heard about your husband. I worked for him some years back before I took to the cattle drives." Francesca narrowed her eyes. "I remember. You broke a bronc in under 5 minutes. Thomas said you had more grit than sense." Prescott gave a tired nod, dismounting. "He said that a lot, if I recall. I came to offer help. Just for the season, if you need it. No charge." "No charge." Her voice was sharper than she meant it. "You expect me to believe a man rides near 100 miles just to offer free labor?" He looked past her toward the house, the sagging porch, the barn with the roof half gone. Then to Willa, who clutched her mother's hand and stared at him wide-eyed. "No, ma'am," he said. "I don't expect you to believe anything, just figured I'd offer." Francesca studied him. He looked like he had been through hell and back, but there was no pity in his eyes, just something quiet. Something steady. "You sleep in the bunkhouse," she said finally, "up at dawn. My kids come first. You understand that?" He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." That night, after the children were asleep, Francesca sat on the porch with a blanket around her shoulders. Prescott worked by lantern light, setting up a new fence post along the south line. She watched him from the shadows. He did not look toward her once. The next morning, he was already fixing the barn roof when she came out with the coffee. Days passed. Prescott did not talk much, but he worked like a man with something to make up for. He taught Wilfred how to stack hay without tipping the cart. He built Willa a wooden swing from an old harness and hung it on the cottonwood tree. Francesca caught herself smiling once when she saw it. Then she caught herself and stopped. A week passed before the tears came again. She had gone to the creek to wash linens and found Thomas's old shirt tangled in the basket. It still smelled faintly of cedar. She sat on the rock and wept, shoulders shaking, hands pressed to her mouth so the children would not hear. She did not hear Prescott until he sat beside her. He did not ask questions. He did not say anything. Instead, he reached out, slow enough she could have pulled away, and with the back of his hand, he brushed a tear from her cheek. She looked at him, startled, and saw something in his eyes that did not demand, did not expect, only understood. "You'll be all right, Francesca," he said softly. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but you will. She didn't know how to answer that. Her throat was tight, her chest hurt, but something in her eased. He stood. I'll walk you back. She rose, fingers brushing his for a moment too long. The next day she laughed. It was a small thing. Willa had spilled a bucket of water and slipped in it, landing in the mud with a squeal. Francesca had turned sharply, ready to scold, but Wilfred's face was so shocked, and Willa's so indignant that she laughed before she could stop herself. Prescott had looked up from where he was hammering planks, saw her laugh and smiled. Not a wide grin. Just the kind of smile that made his eyes crinkle faintly at the corners, like he was seeing something rare and precious. You should do that more often, he said later when the sun had dipped behind the hills. Laugh, he nodded. Feels strange, she admitted. Still good, he said. She looked down at her hands. It's been a long time since anything felt good. He didn't touch her, but he stood close. I can stay through the harvest, he said. If you want. Francesca looked up, met his eyes. There was no rush in them, no pressure, just quiet steadiness. All right, she said, her voice almost a whisper. I want that. The wind stirred the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Francesca stood beside the man who had kissed away her tears without asking for anything, and who had made her laugh when she thought she never would again. And she began to feel, for the first time since Thomas died, like maybe she could breathe again. Like maybe there was more than just surviving. She did not know yet that she would love him, but she would. By late July, the summer heat settled thick over the valley, and the grass around the ranch wore a dull, scorched look. Mornings began with the sound of the pump creaking and ended with tired hands wiping sweat from foreheads. Francesca woke before first light now, not because she had to, but because she wanted to walk the fence line before the children stirred, before the day's labor claimed her. Prescott was already up each time, already working. She found him once at the east pasture, sleeves rolled to the elbows, coaxing a stubborn mule back toward the pen. He didn't notice her approach, which gave her a rare moment to watch him unobserved. He moved with quiet certainty, not the swagger of a man trying to impress, but the calm of someone who had learned to earn trust over time. He caught sight of her and tipped his hat, a small gesture, but it stayed with her all through breakfast. That afternoon, Francesca passed the kitchen window and saw him teaching Wilfred to oil a saddle. Willa sat close by, weaving dandelions into the fringe of an old blanket and humming to herself. Francesca paused with her hands in the wash basin, watching the way Prescott leaned in just enough to show Wilfred without taking over. He didn't speak down to him. He didn't rush. Her son looked up at him like he was seeing something he didn't know belonged in the world, an adult who listened. Later, when the sun dipped low and the air cooled enough to breathe easy, she found Prescott near the well, sharpening a drawknife with a whetstone. The rasp of metal was steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. You always this quiet? She asked, stepping closer. He didn't pause. Only when I figure words would do more harm than good. She rested her hands on the top rail of the fence, eyes on the hills. I used to think silence meant something was wrong. Prescott looked up. Sometimes it means a man's listening. She nodded slowly, then glanced sideways. And what are you hearing now? That you're tired, he said softly, but not just from the work. Francesca blinked, then looked away. A hawk circled high above the ridge, its cry a sharp note against the hush of dusk. It's strange. There's no one left to tell me what to do anymore, and I still feel like I'm waiting for someone to grant me permission. You don't need it, he said. You're already doing it. I'm getting through it, she corrected. He set the whetstone down and straightened. There's a difference. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. I don't know yet. Prescott stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, but enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling air. When I was 17, I lost my brother to a fever. She turned to him, surprised. I rode south after that, he continued. Didn't stop moving for near 5 years. I thought if I put enough distance behind me, the ache would ease. But it just quieted down, waited. Found me again when I stepped into an empty bunkhouse or walked past a boy with his boots on the wrong feet. Francesca's voice was low. So what made it bearable? Working with my hands, he said. And people who didn't try to fix me. Just let me be. They stood in silence for a long moment, the kind that didn't press, didn't ache. Then Francesca exhaled. I started sewing again, she said. Just after the storm last week. The children were asleep and I couldn't rest, so I lit a lamp and found my mother's old basket. Stitched a new hem on Willa's dress. Prescott smiled faintly. That sounds like more than getting through. She gave him a look. Careful, you keep saying things like that and I might start believing you. He leaned against the post beside her. That wouldn't be the worst thing. She didn't reply, but her fingers curled gently around the edge of her apron. The quiet stretched, not uncomfortable, just full of things unsaid. That night, as she tucked Willa beneath her quilt, the little girl asked, "Is Mr. Prescott staying forever?" Francesca paused with the lamp in her hand. "Why do you ask?" "Because he doesn't leave," Willa said. "And he listens when I talk, even when I say things that don't matter." Francesca smoothed the blanket. "They matter to him." Willa yawned. "He makes you less sad." Francesca kissed her forehead and blew out the lamp. Outside, the stars were clear and sharp. Prescott sat by the barn with his back against the wall, whittling something small and careful from a piece of pine. He looked up as she approached. "I should ask," she said. "What are you carving?" He held it out without a word. A tiny horse, rough but honest in its shape. "For Willa," he said. "She said she wanted to ride a real one, but this'll do for now." Francesca took it in her hand, turning it over. "She'll love it." He nodded, then looked up at her, his gaze steady. "You don't have to keep carrying this alone, Francesca," she swallowed. "I don't know how to put it down." "You don't have to," he said. "Just share the weight." She stared at him for a long moment, then stepped closer. Their hands brushed as she passed back the carving. This time, she didn't pull away. "Stay a while," she said. He nodded once, and for the first time she didn't feel like she was asking too much. The wheat turned golden by mid-August, and the days grew heavy with the scent of ripening fields and sweat-soaked cloth. Heat shimmered off the distant hills in waves, and the wind, when it came, was dry and hot like breath from a forge. Prescott worked the north field with Wilfred most mornings now, teaching him how to judge the weight of a scythe swing just right so the stalks bent clean without breaking. Francesca watched from the porch sometimes, a tin pail in one hand, her apron damp at the waist from the well water. Her son followed Prescott's movements with a quiet eagerness, not imitating exactly, but learning the rhythm of work, a rhythm Thomas had never lived long enough to teach him. One evening, clouds gathered over the ridgeline, tall and blue-black, and the air turned close. Francesca moved briskly through the kitchen, setting bowls of beans and cornbread on the table, her hair pinned back, her cheeks flushed from the stove. She glanced once through the window. Prescott was still in the barn, oiling the wagon's axles before the rain came on. She didn't call for him. She just left the door open. When he stepped inside, wiping his hands on a rag, the sky broke wide open. Rain fell hard, drumming on the roof like hooves across the high plain. Willa squealed and ran to press her nose to the glass, breath fogging the pane. Francesca set an extra bowl on the table and nodded toward the seat beside Wilfred. Prescott peeled off his damp hat and hung it on the peg by the door. "Smells real good in here," he said. Francesca didn't answer, just passed him the bread. Later, after the children had been tucked under quilts and the storm had softened to a steady patter, Francesca stood at the edge of the porch, arms folded against the damp. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. She heard Prescott's steps behind her but didn't turn. "You always stand outside after storms?" he asked quietly. "Only when I need to remember how to breathe." The lantern cast a soft glow behind them, catching the rain in the eaves in pale streaks. Prescott leaned against the post beside her, arms loose at his sides. "I'd like to fix the west trough tomorrow," he said. "It's leaking more than it should." "You don't have to ask," she replied. "I'm not asking, just saying I'll be working there." She glanced at him, brows drawn. "Why tell me then?" "Because it matters to me that you know where I am," he said, voice low. Francesca looked down at the boards beneath her feet. "I used to measure my days in meals and mending. Now I measure them by how close you stand." Prescott didn't move. "That scare you?" She nodded once. "More than I wanted to." He reached out slowly, palm up. "May I?" She hesitated, then laid her hand in his. His fingers wrapped around hers, warm and calloused, steady as the land they stood on. "My father used to say a man's worth was in what he stayed for," Prescott murmured. "I've left too many places behind, but I don't want to leave this one." Francesca didn't look away. "What makes this place different, you?" he said simply. The silence held something new now, not absence, but presence. Not waiting, but choosing. When she leaned into him, it wasn't sudden. It was the slow shift of weight toward something known. She felt his arm come around her, sure and careful, and she let herself rest there, forehead against his collarbone. "I never thought peace would come looking like this," she whispered. He pressed his mouth to her hair, his breath warm. "It came through the door you left open." She didn't answer, only held him tighter. Later that night, as the coals in the hearth softened to a red hush, Francesca folded a blanket at the foot of the children's bed, then stepped into the main room. Prescott sat at the table, polishing the blade of a hand hoe. He looked up when she entered, eyes shadowed with something unspoken. "I've made room in the loft," she said. "You don't have to stay out in the bunkhouse come winter." He set the rag down. "That's kind of you." "It's not kindness," she said. "It's what I want." He stood slowly and crossed to her. The lantern's light caught the faint line of the scar along his jaw, but she didn't look away from it. "I won't make promises I can't keep," he said. "But I'll make the ones I can." She took his face in her hands, thumb brushing the edge of that old wound. "Then promise me this," she said. "When the days are hard, you'll still come sit beside me." Prescott bent his head, his lips finding hers with a tenderness that asked nothing but gave everything. The kiss was warm, unhurried, like the sun rising after a long frost. He was the first to kiss away her tears, and now the first to kiss her as a woman learning to hope again. When they parted, Francesca rested her forehead to his. "It's not just the house you've mended," she whispered. "I know," he said, "and I'll keep on." Outside, the rain had stopped. The earth, at last, began to breathe again. By early September, the air lost its sharp heat and took on the scent of cut hay and the first yellowing cottonwood leaves. Mornings came cooler, with hoarfrost edging the pump handle and the fence rails silvered before dawn. Francesca wrapped a shawl over her shoulders now when she stepped outside, and the children took to their lessons earlier in the day, when the light still felt warm on their backs. She had turned the parlor table into a school corner, clearing space for Wilfred's arithmetic slate and Willa's letter practice. Prescott had crafted a small chair from leftover pine, sanded smooth along the edges where Willa's skirts brushed. He never mentioned it, just left it by the hearth one morning with a nod toward the child who now sat taller as she read. One afternoon, while Francesca stitched a gusset into Wilfred's trousers by the window, she heard the sound of Prescott's voice drifting in through the open door. He was in the yard, speaking low but firm, and when she leaned out, she saw the sheriff beside him, hat in hand, his mount pawing at the dry earth. She stepped outside, hands still damp from the cloth. "Something wrong?" The sheriff turned, eyes cautious. "Even in, Mrs. Merritt." "Just passing through, checking in on properties. Folks say you've had a good harvest." "I've had steady hands," she said, glancing at Prescott. The sheriff's gaze lingered on the barn where Prescott had recently repaired the door latches. "You keepin' him on permanent, then?" Prescott's jaw twitched, but he didn't speak. Francesca stepped forward, her voice even. "He earns his place here same as anyone. You looking for trouble, Sheriff?" "No, ma'am," the man replied, adjusting his reins. "Just making sure no one is." When he rode off, the dust curling behind him, Francesca turned. "What was that about?" Prescott looked down at his boots, then back up. "Name travels with me sometimes, not always kindly." She studied him. "Wasn't about your name, no," he said. "But it'll always be about what people think they know." She folded her arms. "Whatever you've done, you haven't brought it here." He met her eyes, something tight easing in his face. "I was court-martialed, Francesca. Back in '78, cavalry. I refused an order I couldn't keep in good conscience." She didn't flinch. "That why you never stayed long in one place?" He nodded. "I won't ask what the order was," she said. "Only if you do it again." "I would," he said. Francesca stepped closer, her voice gentler now. "Then you've got nothing to be ashamed of." He looked at her, and something shifted between them again, not like before, when comfort was cautious and quiet, but like ground settling deep after a long drought. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the far hills, Francesca found him in the shed sharpening the scythe. She brought 2 mugs of chicory brew, still warm from the stove. He took one, nodding thanks, and they sat beside the wall, shoulders near but not touching. "I used to think strength was not needing anyone," she said. "But I was wrong. Strength is knowing when to let someone stand beside you." Prescott looked down at his hands. "I used to carry everything alone, grief, shame, that court-martial. I thought if I kept moving, I could outrun what followed." "You didn't outrun it," she said. "You outlasted it." "I stayed," he said, voice low. "For you, for this." Francesca reached over, her fingers brushing his. "I know." They sat there as the night deepened, the hush between them full of things understood but unspoken. Crickets sang low in the tall grass, and the wind stirred the dry leaves overhead. When she leaned her head against his shoulder, he stilled for a moment, then shifted, letting her rest there fully. It wasn't tentative anymore. It was rooted. "You're the first man who didn't try to fix me," she whispered. "You're the first woman who didn't need me to be anything but what I am." She smiled against his shirt. "That's the first time I've smiled after saying something like that." He turned his head, kissed her temple, slow and sure. And for the first time in years, Francesca felt what it meant to be known not for what she'd lost, or what she still carried, but for who she had become. And the man beside her who had seen all of it and stayed. By the time the first frost settled on the windowsills, the last of the grain had been milled, and the cellar shelves were lined with jars of preserved apples and beans. Francesca had taken to humming again while she worked, soft and tuneless, often without realizing. The sound drifted through the house like something returning home after a long absence. Prescott spent the colder evenings mending tools by the hearth, his long legs stretched out before him. Willa curled up against the rug with her small wooden horse. When Wilfred brought in a splinter from the barn rail and tried to hide the wince, it was Prescott who kneeled and pulled it clean with a steady hand, saying nothing more than, "You did right coming in." Francesca watched from the doorway, her fingers still dusted with flour, a stillness settling in her chest that she hadn't known in years. It wasn't relief, it was something deeper, like the feeling of dry ground slowly taking in rain one morning. As the sun rose pale behind a veil of early fog, she found Prescott in the pasture, lifting a handful of soil and letting it fall in a slow stream. She approached quietly, her skirt damp at the hem from the dew. "You checking on next spring already?" she asked. He rubbed the dirt between his fingers. "Ground's softer than I expected. Might be a good year for oats." She tugged her shawl tighter. "You thinking of planting here?" He stood and brushed his hands clean against his trousers. "I am. If you'd want that." Francesca looked up at him, eyes steady. "I wouldn't have asked you to stay through the winter if I didn't." Prescott reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded page, worn soft at the creases. "I sent a letter to Wyoming Territory last week. My sister's boy is grown now, running cattle near the Big Horns. I let her know I won't be coming back." Francesca took the letter from his hand and ran her thumb over the seal. "You never said you had family." "Didn't feel like mine, not for a long time," he said. "But I reckon I needed to close that door before I could open this one." She looked at him, eyes searching. "Are you sure you're ready for this life?" Prescott's voice was quiet. "I've known a dozen different trails, Francesca. This is the first one I want to walk slow." Later that afternoon, while Willa napped and Wilfred helped haul kindling, Francesca brought out a bundle she'd kept tucked inside her hope chest. She unfolded it slowly over the kitchen table, a quilt top, unfinished, the pieces cut years ago with her mother's old shears. Prescott stepped inside and paused at the sight of it. "It's been waiting longer than I care to admit," she said, smoothing the edge. "Why now?" he asked. Francesca looked down at the fabric, her fingers tracing the seams. "Because for the first time, I know what home looks like." That night, after the children were asleep and the fire had died to embers, Francesca lit a single oil lamp and set it by the window. She didn't speak when Prescott came in from the porch. She just held out her hand. He took it without hesitation. Her room was warm with the scent of beeswax and wood smoke. The shutters rattled softly in the wind, but inside, everything was still. Francesca turned down the quilts with care, her hand steady. When Prescott cupped her face, he did so with reverence, not urgency. "I've never had anything that felt this right," he said. She leaned into him, lips brushing his in a kiss that was slow, certain, and full of quiet promise. "You do now," she whispered. They lay together in the hush of the room, the kind of closeness that asked nothing but gave everything. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the house, for the first time in years, felt whole. By the start of November, Francesca wore no black. Her dresses bore small stitches of color, now soft blue trim, a burgundy hem. She walked with a new purpose, and her eyes held something they hadn't before, not relief, not escape, but belonging. The morning they were wed, they stood beneath the cottonwood tree, with Wilfred holding the small Bible and Willa scattering dry leaves like confetti. Just a few neighbors gathered, enough to witness, not to crowd. Francesca wore her mother's brooch, and Prescott had trimmed his beard with care. "I never expected love to come this quiet," she said softly, as they stood hand in hand. "That's the only kind that lasts," he replied. Afterward, they shared cider on the porch, the children chasing each other through brittle grass. Prescott ran his hand along Francesca's back, slow and sure. "There's a piece of land west of the ridge," he said, "flat enough for a second pasture." She looked at him with a small, knowing smile. "Then we'll plant oats after the frost lifts." Years passed, measured in harvests and birthdays, in fresh paint on the barn and hand-me-down boots passed from Wilfred to Willa. Prescott built a smokehouse beside the shed, and Francesca taught Willa how to stitch a seam tight enough to hold through a storm. The past did not vanish. It softened. They grew not just older, but together weathered in the same wind, warmed by the same fire. And every evening, after the lamps were turned low and the doors latched, Francesca would reach for Prescott's hand beneath the quilt she had finally finished, and he would draw her close without words. Peace didn't come all at once. It came in pieces carved, sewn, earned, and it stayed.